All right, good evening. Welcome. So this is the Faith and Society Lecture Series, and we've been conducting these since about 2017. My name is Dennis Wanacrucis, and I help to organize these talks. And I'm glad you're all here. And also to those of you who are watching on Zoom, thank you for tuning in. And I especially appreciate those of you who are here live, braving the fine weather that we're having here in Ohio, which is really just, this is Ohio, this is how it works. And also I appreciate your coming here despite the game. Although given the way the game's going at the moment, it's probably better that you're here. So it's 5-1 last check for the Yankees. So hopefully by the end of the talk, we'll hear about a great rally and it'll just be all good news. So let me say a few words about the Faith and Society Lecture Series, what it's all about, and then I'll turn it over to the next presenter. So the Faith and Society Lecture Series, well, happily, it's a case of truth in advertising. So we take issues that are of consequence in society, in our culture, and we examine them from a faith-based lens. Not always a faith-based lens, but at least a lens that is going to have some relevance to faith of a religious sort. Not necessarily Christian faith. I think we've got a speaker planned for next semester who is Jewish. So it could be another perspective altogether. It might be from the perspective of someone who's not a believer, but again, addressing matters that are of consequence to the faith. And that's definitely going to be the case tonight. So I hope with that in mind, you kind of think about this. How will this affect us as people in a culture? And especially for those of you who are students, once you're out in the broader, exciting world, these are issues that are going to weigh on you, maybe in a more direct way. So we try to give you these kinds of interesting things to think about. It's a Christian school, Ashland University, but it's not a seminary in a kind of, or it's not a, let's say, an overtly Christian school. So we, as the slogan goes, as the motto goes, we try to teach you how to think and not what to think. So reflect on this. We're not saying believe what Professor Rickabaugh says, but definitely think about it and see where you come down on what he has to say. So it's going to be a very thoughtful talk and one that I hope that you'll benefit from. So let me introduce our next speaker, our provost, Dr. Emil Jarstfer.
Thank you very much. I am glad you're here. Again, we enjoy this fall weather. On behalf of Dr. Campo and the university, welcome. And we're glad that you took time to come out to this tonight. So just in keeping, I just want to give you a little bit from our core values as an institution. Spirituality and faith show up in our core values. And AU affirms Christian values as a core element of the institutional identity, emphasizing faith in God, moral integrity, and respect for the diversity of values and faith in a community of learning. I think we also would affirm very strongly a civil discourse on topics that may be challenging. And from that, I would say as an academic, I recognize the serious work of addressing issues of faith and reason, faith and science, faith and culture. I can say from my undergraduate days, one of the most difficult courses that I took was called Integration of Faith and Learning. And I say that because of the tension and the struggle of rectifying things between faith and what we have that we see more manifest to us. So bless you for participating tonight, and I'll turn it over to Aaron Ross as he introduces our speaker, someone who is a colleague and friend.
Again, thank you all for being here, and I'll be pretty short. I do want to mention one other thing, that we will have a reception afterwards. So anyone who wants to stick around, have some more conversations. After some Q&A, we will have that reception. But just a couple words about Brandon here, Professor Rickabaugh. Just so you know about him, Dr. Brandon Rickabaugh is Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Research Scholar of Public Philosophy at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He also serves as the Kaltura Fellow at the Martin Institute and Research Fellow at, I'm going to say this wrong, but it's
Eidos.
Right. We're also lucky that we both have a mutual friend here. I am going to bring him up, but Mike Fuchsia, who's the director of that institute or director of that Cultura Fellow program there at the Martin Institute, which is a lot of great work here in kind of culture and faith. Back to Brandon, though, his published works focus on what the nature of consciousness tells us about human nature, persons, artificial intelligence, our capacity to know reality, and our interactive life with God. Brandon, thanks so much for being with us tonight, man.
Thank you. Thanks, sir. Good evening. So, thank you for coming out to talk about disillusionment. That's a rough one. But I'm really excited to be here. My first time at Ashland University, a beautiful campus. Want to thank Dr. Campo and Dr. Justifer and Dennis Monacrusis and Aaron Ross, who's been so hospitable to me and so gracious in inviting me here tonight. So I do come from South Florida at Palm Beach, and the weather there is very different than it is here right now. It doesn't get this cold. When it does, which might be 4 or 5 times out of the year, what they have are these alerts about there being iguanas falling out of the trees. So I guess the iguanas will go up into the trees when it's cold and start to hibernate, and then when it gets a little bit warmer, they will fall out of the trees. I've only been there 2 years, so I haven't seen that happen just yet, but I'm looking forward to it. You were shaking your head like you've seen the iguanas in trees alerts. No, you were just shaking your head like. Oh no, it makes sense that's a ridiculous sort of thing to have alerts about. So I want to talk to this evening about what I take to be the state of our culture right now. And it is not the sort of standard line. So I do want to be challenged on this during the Q&A. I'm looking for help on that as well. And what I think Jesus has to say about that in terms of the content of Jesus's teaching. So we're knowing Jesus in a culture of disillusionment. In a recent Variety article, William Shatner, for some of you might know from, I'm going to get it wrong now. I'm not a Trekkie. Is it Trekkie or Trekker? Trekkie. William Shatner reflected on his 2021 voyage into space on Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin space shuttle. He writes this: I love the mystery of the universe. I love all the questions that have come to us over thousands of years of exploration and hypotheses. But when I look into space, there was no mystery, no majestic awe to behold. All I saw was death. I saw a cold, dark, black emptiness. It was unlike any blackness you can see or feel on Earth. It was deep, enveloping, all-encompassing. Everything I had thought was wrong. Everything I had expected to see was wrong. It was among the strongest feelings of grief that I have ever encountered. It filled me with dread. My trip to space was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it felt like a funeral. So Shatner experienced what psychologists call the overview effect, which is common among astronauts. It's an experience of the Earth's ineffable fragility, which results often in this shift or change in their view of the world. They'll be in space and see this vast darkness that seems lifeless and turn to the Earth that seems like an orphan and fragile and small. And it gives them this sense of bewilderment or disillusion. Most people are experiencing their own kind of overview effect, a widespread cultural disillusion. At least that's my argument. In fact, the 7th edition of the National Intelligence Council on Global Trends report characterized the 2021 global societal landscape as, quote, disillusioned, informed, and divided. There's not a more accurate characterization of our culture as one of disillusionment. In the broadest sense, disillusionment is the unsettling experience of seeing that what you once thought was real, meaningful, and important for life is in fact now seen and understood to be an illusion. At a very large scale, the illusory nature of their core social institutions can no longer be ignored. So much has fallen within the past few years, and what remains seems too fragile to stand on. We have placed our trust, knowingly or unknowingly, in what we now understand cannot bear it. Our disillusioned culture. This is important to grasp. Since Charles Taylor described our culture as disenchanted, many sought to re-enchant the world as the solution. Now, of course, reality, I think, has never been disenchanted. I think that's a misnomer. I think that what we have is a culture of individuals who perceive reality as disenchanted. But we are now in a much more dangerous place of being a disillusioned people. Experiences of disillusionment arise when core positive values, ideas, and beliefs are discredited. The experience is a form of negative epistemic affect. Disillusionment is associated with feelings of deep sadness, confusion, disappointment, and a loss of trust and hope. It is the realization of self-deceiving idealizations that bring on so much harm. By definition, disillusionment undermines our fundamental understanding of reality rather than specific events or occasions. It's at the level of one's worldview and at the core of how they see themselves and each other. Experiences of disillusionment are associated with political polarization and aggressive tendencies. That's made manifest to us over the past several years. Other studies have shown that a disposition to disillusionment correlates with a lack of perceived purpose. Moreover, the accompanying damage to central epistemic frameworks in cases of disillusionment actually impede one's efforts to integrate or accommodate new information. Their evidential uptake is actually impaired. The Pew Research Center's February 2022 study revealed growing distrust in, quote, medical scientists to act in the best interests of the public. The military to act on the public's best interests, K through 12 public school principals and police officers, journalists, business leaders, and elected officials. These studies attribute the cause not so much to a new discovery based on knowledge, but often based on tribal loyalty among what psychologists continually are referring to now as a disillusioned people. According to a 2020 Canto national survey, nearly 2/3, that is 62% of Americans, are afraid to share their political views. And a culture afraid to share life-altering views will not be guided by knowledge, but by expressions of power. Such a culture cannot help from being fragmented. Without a shared commitment to pursuing knowledge, there can be no sustainable community across ideological identities. There will be nothing to gather around except for tribal slogans. For the disillusioned, the world seems empty of trustworthy voices. All appears as speculation with little depth. The desires of the heart, the depths and dynamics of the human soul are left unmet. Now, the psychologist Peter Homan sees only 3 options forward for those in the throes of disillusionment, or what he likes to call de-idolization. These 3 ways forward are to respond to disillusionment with paralysis, to disavow your experience of disillusionment, or to correct and seek knowledge in replace of the illusion. The first 2, I think, are easy to show are not at all plausible or helpful, but the third actually ends up being difficult in virtue of the fact that we're disillusioned. This presents a very difficult problem for us. Under paralysis, you could think of this at least in 2 ways, of both political paralysis and cultural paralysis. In almost every election of the past decade, the sustained message from voters and candidates is not so much one of what will work, but one of what hasn't worked and what we need is something new. As Gary Reinhardt observes, quote, American politics in the years since 1968 has thus not been a story of triumph of the right, nor of the splintering of the left, as many scholars contend for so long, but rather one of growing political paralysis arising from increasingly bitter partisan discord and deepening public disillusionment. That disillusionment has been both cause and effect of political and policy paralysis. Now, remaining paralyzed, psychologists have come to recognize that statistically what will lead out of that is strong sense of apathy, cynicism, and chronic discontent. Ironically, the experience of ideological and political polarization unites us as citizens of disillusionment. As Marilyn Robinson observes, quote, I know it is unconventional to say that all Americans are radically divided, polarized, but this is not more true than its opposite. In essential ways, we share false assumptions and false conclusions that are never effectively examined because they are indeed shared. We also have this problem of a cultural paralysis. We create distractions, especially with entertainment and technology. Ironically, many of these distractions become conversations about our disillusionment, our hopes, our fears, our disappointments. In fact, if you look at pop culture, you will see that this conversation about our disillusionment is ongoing, although it might be under the surface. Consider the unlikely example of the TV show Fixer Upper. Are you familiar with this TV show? Do you know what that show is really about? Amen. Yeah, in one way you could think of that. The conversation that I take that show to really be having and why it resonates with people at a really deep level, although they might be unaware of it, is the question as to whether or not something ruined can be made wonderful again. That's the question that the show is after. And this is why it has such resonance with people. And as someone who was at Baylor University for 5 years, I experienced that radical cultural moment of everyone coming to buy whatever Chip and Joanna said we should buy. But underneath that, I take this to be an issue of disillusionment. The problem is so troubling that it creeps up through our attempts at distraction. Social media, I might have time to talk about that, plays a huge part here. But what about disavowal? To disavow our disillusionment is perhaps one of the most argued for approaches among psychologists today. And the studies that have been produced argue that the evidence favors what we should have as a theory of nostalgia. In recent years, successful political campaigns have traded on the disenchantment of citizens and promised to restore their country to its past glory. This is a calculated response to psychological studies that diagnose the problem of disillusionment by the struggle of the disillusioned to maintain significance and meaning in their lives, and the observation that nostalgic contemplation can provide the missing meaning by encouraging one's sense of social connection, which thereby undermines collective angst. In a 2021 study published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, a team of researchers conclude the following. Disillusionment is a state of shattered assumptions that signal major disruption to epistemic frameworks. Disillusioned individuals feel lost and hopeless about the future. Yet, despite the extreme nature of the experience, there are internal self-regulatory resources that allow one to maintain a sense of meaning simply by reflecting on the past. Thus, appeals to former greatness are powerful, at least in part, because they enable people to experience a sense of significance and purpose, a desire to achieve greatness again. The suggestion literally is to take on nostalgia as a way to assuage the feelings of disillusionment. Now, other studies also that don't deny this, but they also suggest that we also have the resources in terms of practicing one's sense of gratitude, religiosity, or self-compassion as means of overcoming disillusionment with one's perceived meaning. Now, I don't know about you, but that hits me as fairly naive. I mean, nostalgia is rarely thought of as a good thing. The disavowal by a therapy of nostalgia response assumes that the problem of disillusionment is a lack of perceived personal significance and meaning. But the diagnosis makes the symptoms, this misdiagnosis, rather, the symptoms for the problem. This is, in fact, an example of the reduction of the human person to a mechanism, to behavior. Here, disillusionment is reduced to behaving in a certain way, as if one's life has no meaning. And like all reductions of human persons, the nostalgia answer fails to attend to the true nature of the human person, or so I will argue shortly. It is a project that has no promise of delivering what we need. Disavowing one's disillusionment is profoundly destructive, as other studies show. It leads to attacking the events and people seen as responsible. And again, we've seen this firsthand. Now that leaves us then with this third option. The first two do not seem to be plausible. There don't seem to be good reasons, and there are good reasons, I think. I've suggested to think that there must be alternatives if we're going to have a way through disillusionment. If we're not, then we're stuck, and now we've just got to move on to entertainment. But as I've mentioned, in our own entertainment and technology, this question still keeps coming up, no matter how hard we try to suppress it. It's as if our disillusionment, the shattered illusions that we once held as being real, is revealing something to us about the real nature of reality. And so the remainder of my time with you is going to spend exploring this third option, this option of seeking knowledge, or what I'll describe or talk about as a return to reality, which I take it to be what Jesus's insight is going to offer in terms of us coming to terms with and flourishing through our disillusionment. I'm going to think that what disillusionment that we have now is a failure of two things: a failure of knowledge and a failure to recognize the soul. Disillusionment is a failure of knowledge, fundamentally, and a failure of understanding the nature of human persons at the level of the soul. So why think that disillusionment is a failure of knowledge? Well, you've got this study here that lists the main and rank in order the various reported experience of disillusionment, and I've highlighted there those features that are related to knowing, either the phenomenology of knowing or the structure of epistemic states within the psychological structure of the person. It seems clear that what disillusionment just actually is a recognition that what we thought we knew, we no longer know. But it gets worse than that, because the despair that's worse than disillusionment leads individuals to think that, well, there is just no way to move forward. There's no way to have knowledge about these things. And in a world where there is no knowledge or no possibility of knowledge is a world where you have no place to stand. And we all know this in our everyday experience. If you want to get help with your toothache, you'll go to a dentist and not to a mechanic. Knowledge affords particular right and responsibility given whatever the problem is that you need to solve and the knowledge that one has for it. And if we can't know what reality is, what human persons are, and if we can't even have the possibility of coming to know things, then of course we'll be disillusioned. And I'll argue in a few moments, this is why Jesus places his particular philosophical arguments and worldview in terms of a kind of knowledge that is publicly available to test. This in and of itself provides some reason to come out of a disillusionment. It isn't shocking that politics, the economy, and the media have failed us. But what we didn't expect, I think, was for the sciences to fail us. We are, after all, in a time where scientists and technology innovators are, in a very real sense, our new priests. The widespread cultural dogma is a religious form of scientism, this confidence in the salvation of science implemented through technology. The belief that if there is either anything that can be known or those things that are most worthy of being known are those things that only can be demonstrated through the sciences. Now, what we have in cases of disillusionment is both a failure of the sciences to provide the kinds of answers that we need to sustain a sort of meaning in our life. But it's much worse than that. Secondly, an inability to even come up with a research program for how we would approach an answer to this. And then even worse, third, reasons to think that that project is ill-conceived, because the sorts of things that constitute the meaning of one's life, what is real, what is a good person, how does one become a good person, how can we know such things, are well outside the demarcation of the natural sciences. This infects culture at every level. Disillusionment is a problem of knowledge. It is a problem at the level of worldview. And so the answer can't be local, but must be at the core of what forms and sustains one's view of the world. Now, if we have no theory of knowledge that makes it possible for us to know what a meaningful life is and how to make progress in becoming the kind of person that is truly unique and beautiful and brilliant with a meaningful life, well, then disillusionment makes sense. Although you might then ask the question, is disillusionment really the right word, or have we just come to terms with the sad fact of reality that Shatner experienced, which is ultimately the backdrop is just Black death. The nature of the human person is at this core too. Sorry, let me say one more thing about knowledge here. Knowledge is important because it affords rights and responsibilities to us. That is to say, knowledge is more important than merely having beliefs or commitments or confessions to things, because beliefs can be false. You can confess things that you don't believe that are also false, and you can commit to things that you don't confess or believe. Knowledge requires truth. That is, knowledge affords one the ability to commune with reality, and that's, if we're going to have a flourishing life, what it will require. You cannot flourish in life if you're constantly bumping up to things that harm you. We need knowledge of what reality actually is and its truth to flourish. Disillusionment shows us that we need to have both that kind of knowledge, but also the possibility of gaining that kind of knowledge, because when it's stripped away and what we thought we knew, we no longer know, and we no longer have the hope of coming to know because no one is trustworthy, the institutions have failed, well, now there's no project to come to terms to return to reality. And knowledge is also important because it's publicly available. It's not privatized like belief is. If we want to come to know something, we have to form community. We have to gather around reality and discuss it based in terms of the evidence and the reasons and the experiences that we have about reality. Share them and challenge them with each other. Now, this breaks disillusionment as well, because now we have a group of individuals gathered around a project that we can test among each other. What we have right now is not a community or groups of communities gathering around reality to discuss what it is that we can know about it. We have radical disintegration of culture, where the way that we identify our groups now is not around about what's real or the reasons and evidence and experiences that I can give to you for thinking that these views are true or false, but just slogans that if you identify with, now you can become part of my tribe. Well, no wonder we're disillusioned. Now you've got this problem of human persons. Human persons, the nature of human persons is at the core of what it would be to have a meaningful life if there were a meaningful life. Because a life, if it is truly meaningful, is a life that flourishes. But the flourishing of something has to be in accord with its nature, right? I know very, very little about plants, but I hear that if you put them in a kind of light that they don't do well in, they will die. And it's according to their nature, not according to what I think or believe or desire about it. Certain plants need a certain amount of sunlight. They need a certain amount of water. If you don't understand that, you cannot help it flourish. Or said differently, you cannot love or provide for the well-being of that plant. Now, push that out to human persons, and the analogy seems to be just as intuitive. If there is no nature for a human person, or if we don't know or can't know the nature of a human person, well, then how can we flourish? How can we help others flourish? And how could we be the recipients of love or become the kind of person that can love others, someone that cherishes another person and reliably provides for their well-being, which we know to be what love is. Now, there's two competing notions of what it is to be a human person. Historically, the traditional view is what I described in my work as a bodily soul view. On the bodily soul view, the human person is holistically unified as a psychophysical substance that's comprised of a body and soul. They're a unity. They're a true unity. The dominant view in our culture today, though, is a view called physicalism. And according to physicalism, you, the human person, just is an aggregate of purely physical parts that are arranged in the right kind of way and function in the right kind of way, whatever it is that a brain or neural structure functions, or whatever it is that a biological organism that constitutes a body functions. So that's what you are. You're either this holistically unified thing with a particular nature, or you are particles arranged person-wise. Now, particles arranged person-wise doesn't seem to have any robust characteristics under which it could flourish. This podium, according to this theory, is not here. It's particles arranged podium-wise. Now, the other threat to disillusionment, or the other threat to reality, which hinders our ability to see it and brings upon us disillusionment, is the other thesis of physicalism, which says that all facts about human persons are ultimately, not just in principle, but are discoverable by the physicist. It's going to be a story about atomic structure, quarks, gluons, whatever end up being the fundamental particles, and the external relations among them. Now, good luck finding love there, or in my area, consciousness there. That would be a fun debate to have if you're curious about that during the Q&A. That would be fun to talk about. Can you get consciousness from an aggregate of purely physical parts that just stand in external relations to one another? This is called the hard problem of consciousness. Or in the neurosciences, the binding problem, both of which do not seem solvable. They're not a problem for the bodily soul view. The bodily soul view makes sense of human life in terms of you being a unique kind of psychophysical organism, one that has a particular kind of nature that is quite profound. Marilyn Robbins is fond of pointing out that, quote, there are more neurons in the human brain than there are stars in the Milky Way, making the brain the most complex object known in the universe. It is the soul, however, that she regards as the most marvelous. In her book, When I Was a Child, I Read Books, Robinson observes the following, quote, if we are to consider the heavens, how much more are we to consider the magnificent energies of consciousness that makes whomever we pass on the street a far grander marvel than our galaxy? And she's in some sense riffing off of C.S. Lewis's line, which is, look, you have never met an ordinary person. Never met an ordinary person. If you could see people as they actually are, you would see them either as horrors because of their great ruined state, or you would see them as things that you would have a difficult time not worshiping because of how brilliant and beautiful they actually are. Now, on the physicalist story, there is no actual persons to consider or to care about. Everything is reduced to a behavior or a function. What ends up being a case of love is mistaken It's actually a case of particular neural states. Now, I had a year-long fellowship studying neuroscience, and I'll tell you that much of what gets put out there is largely disinformation in media. My time spent with many neuroscientists, they're baffled by me even asking the question as to what do you think an analysis of love is? What is consciousness? How is it that people respond to beauty in the world? That's just not in their vocabulary. What they're working on largely are pharmaceuticals. They're working on mapping the neural correlates of consciousness, which we're getting very, very decent. I should say we're getting decent results. Our tools right now are not fine-grained enough to tell us much more than this particular area of the brain has this kind of blood flow or lack thereof, and this presence of oxygen or lack thereof. And then the computer simulations give you the neat graphics that people can point to sometimes and say, well, that's where love is. That's where you are. That's where meaning and purpose is. I know no argument to show us that that's actually the case. And if you look at yourselves that way, you've lost yourself. Now, a move to becoming more theological now, and I'm more than happy to do that as a philosopher, and I'm going to try to continue to give arguments here. What does Jesus have to say for the disillusioned in its relation to disillusionment as a problem of epistemology, of knowledge, and a problem of the soul? And I want to say that's actually at the core of what Jesus taught. And here's where I'll get into trouble. I will be very surprised if what I'm about to say is what most of us have ever heard in a church before about what Jesus actually taught. Did Jesus have anything to say about knowledge? Don't hear a whole lot of Christians talking that way, but it turns out that's what he really cared about. I'm thoroughly convinced, but very happy to be shown otherwise, that Jesus had very little interest in getting people to believe things. That was not at all interesting to him, because he understood that beliefs are a pretty fragile place to live life from. They do not sustain life. The one place in Scripture that defines what salvation is, Jesus defines it in John 17:3 as knowledge, not belief. He defines it as knowledge of God, for which constitutes knowledge. Now, what I'm getting at here is the disillusionment that we face with the church in terms of us trading in a very weak, anemic gospel. I want to give an argument for that in a moment. Consider these words from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He says, "Will not the very moment of great disillusionment with my brother or sister be incomparably wholesome for me, because it is so thoroughly teaches me that both of us can never live by our own words and deeds, but only by the one word, capital W, and deed that really binds us together, the forgiveness of sins in Jesus Christ. The bright day of Christian community draws wherever the early morning mist of dreamy visions are lifted. The greatest threat of disillusionment is not the disillusionment of a secular culture, of which I'm not convinced there actually is such a thing. I don't know what it would mean for a culture to be secular, in the sense of I don't know what it would mean for there to be a culture where God is not actively involved in doing things. I also don't know what it would mean for a church to be the sorts of thing that, if it's effective, stands in any way that is not creating culture. The distinction between the two, I think, is both artificial and unhelpful. Regardless, I think that the disillusionment that is the most dangerous in our time is the disillusionment within the church. And the only answer that I know to dealing with that is, one, own it. Own the fact that, there's a book that I've been working on, and I want to call it Disillusioned with Christ, but the editor and the publishers that I've talked with don't like that because it sounds bad. But the title is supposed to get at two things. One, people are disillusioned with Jesus within and outside the church. And I think in many cases, they're right to be disillusioned because the picture of Jesus that they've received is not one that's altogether accurate. But secondly, I think Jesus is more than happy. And in fact, I think he's waiting in pains to sit with us in our disillusionment. And so we can be disillusioned with Jesus in this respect. Now, this will make sense, I think, only in front of a backdrop of what Jesus really taught. And what Jesus really taught, he referred to as the gospel of the kingdom of God. And the gospel of the kingdom of God was simply Christ's announcement that the world is not disenchanted, that we have every bit to think that whatever disillusions that we have to wrestle with, and he brought on the cause for many, are ultimately resolved and solved and cared for by the fact that God's kingdom has come to bring about the love and justice that will undo the evil and corruption in the world. And that he will principally do that through the renovation of the inside of people's heart, body, mind, and soul. That if you wash the inside of the cup, the outside of the cup will be clean as well. Meaning, Jesus offers to make good on God's original covenant with Israel, which is to remove their heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. His gospel is to radically bring heaven into your life right now. Now, there is no more powerful way that I know of to undermine the gospel of the kingdom of God than to reduce that gospel to a matter of mere belief. Like I said, you can believe things that are wrong, and you can commit to believing things that you actually don't believe. Belief is very easy to come by. What Jesus cared about was making knowledge of God and life in his kingdom available to people. And one of the principal ways that he did this, especially if you look in Matthew 22, the great debates that he had there, and then also at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, his argument, I want to say, principally there is one of arguing that human nature has not been understood by the professors of the time. That we have radically reduced human persons to mechanisms that rule you in or outside of God's love. And here are some of the ways that your body might behave in a mechanistic way that make you outside of God's love. If you menstruate, if you have leprosy. A social equivalent of that today might be if you've got serious depression. If your neurochemistry is acting in a particular way, you are outside of God's love. Now, Jesus comes along and says, no, that's not the case. In fact, let me give you some real good arguments that will never solve the problem. If you think that what's really going on in your life is an issue about how you behave, the external relations that you have, well, then let's take a look at lust. And if you think lust is just looking at people in a particular way or behaving with people in a particular way, well, that's really easy to solve. All you've got to do is pull your eyes out. Now, that's what philosophers call a reductio ad absurdum. It's a way of showing that someone's view is radically false because it produces this consequence that we all know can't be true. You can pull someone's eyes out and then still struggle with lust. So Jesus's argument there has to do with making God's kingdom available to people against the mechanization of human persons and culture, which divorces them from the interior of their life as a bodily soul. The soul is also central to the way of Jesus. Jesus's teachings about human psychology were ahead of his time. Contemporary psychology was born out of, and in many ways still remains slave to, a theory of behaviorism, a theory of mind or consciousness that just says that the psychological dispositions that one have are just identical to the way that they behave. So you are in a state of pain provided you behave as if you're in a state of pain. The way that you act tells you what you are. Now, Jesus thought that that was radically at odds with both human experience and what makes life meaningful and sustainable. His view was that it is the inside of the person that needs to be taken care of, and the external stuff will take care of itself. Because we all know you can act as if you got it together. You can act as if you love someone and actually not love them. It's why it's so easy in our culture to model and champion a morality that raises barely above the level of a hobby, because it's easy to post something online with the right hashtag, according to whoever says is right, and you have a sort of moral high ground. It's also really easy to send the right amount of money to the right place, and now you are someone who's concerned with love for other people. But notice that it's almost always people that are not near you. They're never people that you have to live with, face, and actually really care for. You can send the money without changing on the inside. But if you want to become concerned with issues of love and justice and making things right, Jesus thinks you have to be changed from the inside out. Now, this makes sense then of why we have a problem of disillusionment, because we are at a point in time where people don't think that you can have knowledge about how to become a good person, or if there is such a thing. And so how could you change on the inside to become loving? What sort of way would you go about doing that? I like to ask my students all the time, what is a good person? How do you become one? Especially my students that study psychology, because it turns out that you can get a PhD in psychology and never study what a human person is. I spent time in the neuroscience department bothering them by asking that question constantly. Where do you go to study what a person is? And there isn't a course. The courses are all about subpersonal mechanisms, chemical neurobiology. Now, Jesus thought that the link between human nature and human flourishing is undeniable. He says that a healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Now, there's some radical disillusion for you there. You might think that the world prizes and values love, and we want that. But who can point to where love is trustworthy or reliable? This is a difficult thing. This is a very, very difficult thing. So we've got a culture right now that in many ways we've seen it as illusory and in the right way. And one way to think about the life of faith that Jesus calls people to is one of disillusionment, in the sense of giving up the sort of ideas that you had about God that are false, to really come into communion and fellowship with who God actually is. This is a really neat way to talk about faith with undergraduate, well, I think even with my graduate students too, is I like to pose this sort of question. Can you take Jesus seriously and not struggle with doubt? I don't think you can. I think if you take Jesus seriously, you will be provoked to have doubt. Not because Jesus isn't credible, but because who Jesus is and what he brings is so far beyond what we thought could be real that it tests our abilities to trust love in a world that has trained us not to. If you take Jesus seriously, you're going to have issues of doubt. And the disillusionment factor plays heavily there, because what happens is we come to realize that perhaps what we were worshiping was not so much God, but our idea of God. And let the idea fall, Jesus says. One way to think about the way that Jesus is talking is to think about him saying, let's return to reality. And that, I think, is the answer to a disillusioned culture. So go back to William Shatner and his experience of the overview effect. Shatner literally had no place to stand. And this is what a lack of knowledge will do. It will give you no place to stand, no place to anchor any sort of hope or consolation. And a lack of knowledge of the human soul drains the world of its meaning and the activity of God. One of the reasons I'm convinced that people don't think that they hear God's voice isn't because they don't. It's because they're so plugged into all the other voices in the world that they can't distinguish their own from others, much less God's voice. If we don't understand how it is that the human soul operates and acts, it will be very difficult for us to understand not just what's going on inside of ourselves, but what it is that God is inviting us into. And so we have to return to an anthropology of the soul. So to know Jesus in our disillusionment is to come to know the following: that reality is more reliable than we actually think it is, that love actually can be trusted and we can know so, that we can become students of Jesus in our brokenness and our disillusionment, knowing that God is active in our lives, active in our culture, to do more than we can possibly imagine. To know Jesus in our disillusionment is to answer disillusionment in the same way that any other human problems are rightfully answered, and that is spiritual formation into the likeness of Christ, to live from a place of knowing and being known by God. That is, from that place, our disillusionment will be replaced with faith, hope, and love, which cannot disappoint. I think I'll end there, so we've got time for questions. Your attention there and putting up with me. So I am not easily offended by ideas. We'll be really easily offended by my daughter when she doesn't want to give me a hug. But I want help with this. I want the greatest pushback that you can bring, the greatest skepticisms that you can bring, in the same way that that's exactly what Jesus wanted. So please don't be shy to just call me an idiot. Just tell me why you think I'm an idiot.
Okay, so if you have a question, and the last speaker we had a really good policy, and I like it, so I think we should adopt it, which is to have students ask the first questions. So if any students have questions, please feel free, and I'll get you guys first, so I'll bring the mic to you. And if not, then we'll move on to others. But any students want to go first, that would be great.
We're professor, we like uncomfortable silences. I'm good with it. I'm also good with calling on people.
Yeah, you can call them.
Oh, no, I'm not going to call. That's mean. That's horribly mean.
All right, well, I'll go ahead and get you then. Hold on. Well, because of the Zoom and all that, because recording.
What's your name? Margaret. Nice to meet you, Margaret.
I just had a question regarding table 1. Can you pull that slide up again? I just wondered if there was any significance. You had some areas that were highlighted in green and
Yes.
others were white. Is there some reason?
Yeah. So the highlighted sections, this is a slide you're talking about. These highlighted sections, so the whole table orders the kinds of characterized experiences or characteristics of experiences that are reported on the psychological research on disillusionment. So at the top is categorized as a feature of discovery, is at the core or center of disillusionment, experiences disillusionment. The content of this is something like reported that discovering that something was not as good as once believed to be. That is the dominant character trait of people that struggle with disillusionment. And then there are others. And I highlighted those in blue that pick out context and features that are features about states of knowing or epistemic features. And I did that to make the argument that disillusionment is an epistemic problem. It's a problem of knowing. It's not a problem of behaviors. It's not a problem of prodding people to act the right sort of way. It's a problem at the level of knowledge, a failure to know, or to come to recognize that what you thought you knew is not actually the case. And that's what the blue is supposed to highlight there, all the different epistemic features. Is that helpful? Yeah. It's actually very, very fascinating. Because the treatments, like I mentioned, nostalgia does not touch any of these features in any meaningful way. Because nostalgia is not an epistemic device. Nostalgia is not an epistemic property. It's not the sort of thing that is intended to get you knowledge of the world. It's a subjective psychological state. And so when I go through the research, I want to ask this question. Well, are the studies trying to find solutions that actually track the central or more salient features about this experience that people are going through? And if they don't track states of knowing, like nostalgia doesn't, then I know that there's a problem. But then again, for a culture that's disillusioned and doesn't think that this kind of knowledge is available, this is a symptom of the problem.
You said that we could solve our problem of disillusionment through knowing and being known by God.
Yeah.
Do you have suggestions for people who might not necessarily believe in God because of like their disillusionment in the world, like you were showing that study?
Yeah.
How would you proceed with that for people who don't necessarily know or want to be known by God?
Ooh, I mean, that's even more profound, that they don't want to be known by God. Yeah, so this is a really fun and complex case. I'm going to say that if this is someone that I'm talking with, that I'm going to invite them into community with me. Because the kinds of the beliefs that we hold, if we know much from, say, attachment theory studies in psychology, it's that the beliefs that we have about ourselves, the expectations of how the world is going to treat us, and our expectations about how God is going to be in relationship to us, if there is a God, are deeply ingrained in us from before we're even born by how it is that we're cared or not cared by our primary caregivers. So I just don't think that issues of belief in God are going to be super simple. So I think that there are profound arguments for God's existence. I think that there are no good arguments against theism. I think that there are very strong arguments for Christianity and not very strong arguments against Christianity. And I would talk with someone if they wanted to talk about that. But I would take it that usually the struggle is more interpersonal and one that Christians experience all the time. And I would include myself in there. Like I said, believing what Jesus says is, because what he says is so radically subversive, can be very hard. So let me back up. I'll just say the easiest way to think about this is you just go about it how you'd want to go about knowing anything. You investigate reality, you return to reality. If you struggle with believing that God exists, don't try to believe that God exists. Try to come to know whether or not God exists. And the way that Jesus invited people was through a radical empirical test. For those who have ears, let them hear. If you want to come and know about this stuff, come and live with me. You want to know if God exists and God is like who Jesus says he was, then you just try to take Jesus seriously and live the kind of life that he lived in the manner in which he did it. And it will become evident to you that that's actually how reality is. Now, if you don't want to believe that God exists, then I think God gives you the space to not believe. And again, this comes down to any knowledge discipline. Pick out any knowledge discipline: chemistry, physics, biology, theology, philosophy, and I think you'll come to find that you cannot force knowledge on anyone. If someone doesn't want to know something, they will not come to know it. So if someone doesn't want to know if God exists or what it's like to be in relationship with God, my job is just going to be to care for them in whatever way they're open and accepted to. Right? But I'm not in charge of trying to manipulate or manage people's beliefs into things. I'm going to try to get them to interact with reality from where they're at, because I think that's what Jesus did. What do you think, though? All right. Thanks for the question. It's a good one. I think we had two.
So going back to the previous discussion about nostalgia, as a attempted cure for disillusionment, I wonder if the opposite is actually true, that nostalgia often creates disillusionment, that our previous experience with something sets us up to believe that something else should happen. And so I'm just kind of looking through the list of things: feeling upset or lost, discovering that something's not as good as it once. I mean, I have that experience every year when I go and buy Blueberry cereal at this time of year. It's not as good as I remember it. And I think about Jesus, and I think about the times that that he seems to be disillusioned. And I think about the fig tree that doesn't have any figs on it, and he's upset at the fig tree and he curses the fig tree. And obviously it's a metaphor for other things, but obviously I think that fits in the category. But one of his big ones is when he gets to the temple and he sees all the money changers and he turns over the tables and that kind of stuff. And I think that the case could be made that his previous experience in the temple, maybe at the age of 12, before the Sanhedrin was moved out and the money changers were moved in, created a nostalgia that then he responds against. Again, also a metaphor, but just wanted to throw that out there, that sometimes maybe nostalgia creates disillusionment instead of the opposite.
So I would think that that's not the case with Jesus. So for a couple of reasons. One, disillusionment is an epistemic failure, or the recognition of an epistemic failure. So we'd have to get into those sorts of issues. But even too, just on the narrative of Jesus visiting the synagogue, we realize that he was pointing out problems there. I'm not sure he would have looked back at that as in nostalgia. And so I wouldn't tend to think of Jesus having any sort of moment of disillusionment. This is a good question, though. But I do think that you're right, and for the two reasons that I gave. But I do think that you're right that nostalgia can even harm, because, like you said, your cereal is not as good as I thought it would. But it's all, it's sort of, just pick sort of any period of time, and some generation is going to say things were not as bad as they are now. If you go back. Good. That's right. Good. Yeah. And I think I tried to mention the way that our politics often works now plays on our nostalgia. Yeah. If we could just go back to the way that Reagan had it, we could, just pick whoever it is.
Hi,
What's your name?
Kendra.
Kendra. And I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
So I'm going to pick up on what you just said, talking about people are saying, oh, things are not as bad as they are now. So you're talking about this societal disillusionment and that it's based in lack of faith in the sciences and technology. So clearly, though, thinking back, this can't be the first time that this has happened.
Right.
So I want to know, I would like some other examples of what you think that is. But then I have a part two question.
Good.
So you're talking about that this is, and I'm going to leave Jesus out of this for a moment. So you're talking about—
How dare you?
I'm
kidding.
So you're talking about that this is a personal journey towards knowledge, and that is the way out of disillusionment. Do you think that can really change this on an individual level?
Yeah, I think we've got the greatest amount of evidence shows us that in everyday experience. But let me try to keep track of the questions. So the first one, so I want to make sure that I'm sort of tracking really clearly, is that your first question is I tried to argue that we're in a place of disillusionment in part because the trust that we've put into the sciences and technology has brought about greater harm than we expected it to. And so, but the advancements of science that we have now are not what we have had in previous generations, but we have had disillusionment before. So there's got to be some other explanation. Am I understanding your question? So you wanted other examples? Yeah.
Yeah, sort of, because I feel like this is something that clearly has happened before.
Oh, yeah.
These are just the reasons for what it's happening right now. I mean, I imagine it happened at the time of the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
And just, countless times before. And so really, I just wanted to see if that's what you thought as well.
Yeah.
But then how do we stop this iterative process here? How do we stop this from happening over and over?
Good. This is a question I like to spend a lot of time thinking about. And I teach a class in the philosophy of technology that tries to look at this historically even. And so you're right that what we have in terms of the scientific progress that we've got today is not what we had, say, 100 years ago, or even like 50 years ago in terms of technology. But technology is not anything new. So like you said, the Industrial Revolution brought about lots of disillusionment. One of them was in the sense that our ability to have a particular kind of power far exceeds our ability to steward it well. So you had during the Industrial Revolution problems of creating particular environments for work that brought about deaths of many individuals. But you also had this too, the advent of the printing press that brought about the Reformation. You also had this in the time, when Rome built aqueducts and spread diseases. Aristotle talks about this in terms of machinery like a hammer or something, or also the sort of technology that you would use. And he did think of it as a technology in religious practices. And those will bring about radical disillusionment too, which is in many ways like the birth of philosophy, the realization that the Oracle at Delphi is not reliable, let's say. So I think that what we have here is just a retelling of the same sort of story over and over and over again, which is an escape from reality. We build things that fail, and the way out of it is a return to reality. If the world isn't just illusory, now the world just might end up being illusory. How do we come to know that? Well, now it sounds like we're in a paradox, or I wouldn't even say a paradox. I think then it becomes clear that the world is not an illusion. Otherwise, we couldn't know that. You have to know that to come to know whether or not it is an illusion. So I think, how do you move forward on this? I have simple things, going home and recognizing that my daughter is unique. And if she stopped existing, just like you, if you stopped existing, the world literally would not be as magnificent as it is right now. Now, I can know that, though, by understanding what people are, the great beauty that comes from creativity, the tragedy that comes from seeing someone being treated unjustly. I don't have to reason through it. I just see that someone should not be treated that way. So we return, I think, to the sort of common insights that the average person has about what's good, true, and beautiful. And we start there and we move forward. That's how I think it's always been. And I think that's how it often is just in day-to-day life. I'm not sure though, but how does that sit with you though? Am I being too nostalgic? Let me put it a different way. The test is, can love be trusted? That's the test. If I can come to know that love can be trusted, then these things are solved. But the problem is that we've called things loving that aren't loving and trusted them to care for us that cannot care for us. We've seen those turn into illusions, and now we've got to return to reality, to return to what really is love. Okay. What is your name?
Thanks very much. My name's Peter Slade, who so rudely shouted out Jesus when you were talking about Chip and Joanna Gaines. But I do think that show, like you do, is about redemption. I also think that often we ask questions and we know the right answer is Jesus. And I feel maybe some of that might be going on here. But I want to ask you, because I thought I heard you say something, that Jesus didn't experience disillusionment. Is that?
Yeah.
Did you say that?
Yeah.
Well, famously, of course, on the cross and in Mark's gospel, most starkly,
Good.
Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I'm looking at that little chart above your head. And
Yes.
Jesus is scoring pretty high on that chart.
Good.
And Jürgen Moltmann, the German theologian, in his
Yes.
famous work, The Crucified God,
Yes.
would say to you, I think, you're exactly right. Religion has no place for a disillusioned Messiah. But he says that's the end of religion and the beginning of something new. If Jesus, in fact, is fully human and holds out the hope of redemption for us as humans, then I would argue a Jesus who doesn't experience God-forsakenness, who doesn't, using Moltmann's term, or disillusionment, in fact, using your term, isn't any use to us.
Good.
And isn't a God isn't
Good.
a Messiah worth knowing.
Great. This is really
There's
good.
a pushback.
I think so, but I also, yeah, good. I don't think it is. Here's a couple reasons why. One, well, sorry, let me try to get at the core of this. So the dereliction of the cross, I think if you do an honest psychological evaluation of that, what you have is a conflict of second personal awareness between the Father and the Son. And the
I have to
Trinity.
do that very slowly. for us.
I'm sorry.
You're going to do that slowly.
So the second personal awareness that psychologists talk about is well, it's unfairly and unaccurately portrayed as the sort of thing that can be missing with people that are on the very high spectrum of autism. We know that that's not the case now, but it is the kind of thing where an individual does not experience being known by another person as a person. And and Eleanor, I'm writing off of Eleanor Stump's work here, one of my favorite philosophers. I think that the dereliction of the cross. So you've got a couple ways you can go, and I think that there's a long story to be told because Moltmann has got particular kinds of philosophical commitments that I think are incoherent. We'd have to start with those, though, right? Because his whole phenomenological project is based on anti-realism. Well, if your phenomenological project is based on anti-realism, then you can't have legitimate insights into who God is. All you can have are insights into your experience of what you call God.
So to put that in more familiar language.
Sorry,
are you saying that so Moltmann's coming out of a Barthian tradition, you must have revelation?
No,
Is
no,
that not what you're saying?
No. I didn't say anything about Barth. I didn't say anything about revelation. I'm just saying that his view of the relationship between your mind and the world is such that your mind really can't get what is real.
Okay.
Your mind can only get your perceptions of reality. So this theory about the crucified God isn't a theory about God. It's a theory about one's experience of God. But we know that one's experiences of God do not entail that they actually are of God or interpreted in the right way. So my pushback to Moltmann would just be to say, if you want to answer the sort of work that I'm doing here, then we're going to have to start at the very beginning of whether or not knowledge of the world is actually possible. And so I would say for Moltmann, he's part of the establishment that's brought apart the disillusionment that we've got right now. Because you can't understand Jesus's life and ministry if it isn't about knowing how the world really is. And it's just privatized by your individual experiences of God. In fact, I think that's exactly what Jesus was trying to pull people out of, into community. Now, the other thing to be said here too is that remember the way that we evaluate psychological reports like these are going to be in terms of the reliability of the first person awareness of what's going on. And I take it that what Jesus was depicting there in the dereliction on the cross was not the same sort of self-analysis that went on in these studies. So I get very uncomfortable when we want to take very modern conceptions of the way that you analyze someone psychologically and put them on the way that and assume that that's how Jesus was thinking about those things. So I just am uncomfortable about that.
Okay, and I completely agree. I think the pursuit of the psychology of Jesus is a dead end.
Well, now that's not what I said.
Well, I would say because the texts, like you said, they're ancient texts, and they're not concerned with that. I would take the line that, first of all, the gospel writers, a basic assumption of the gospel writers is what Jesus says is true. I mean, we're not even getting into just from the people who wrote those gospels. They don't have Jesus being confused. They don't have Jesus telling lies. Jesus is the truth. When he speaks, it's true. So we can assume that when Jesus says, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" the gospel writers and the community that received those texts believe that to be true. So then your question and mine is, what does a first century Jew or mean by God has forsaken me? Is disillusionment then a sort of modern phenomenon as opposed to a physical reality?
Well, those aren't mutually exclusive. You can have a modern phenomenon that is actually a real phenomenon. So those aren't mutually exclusive.
Right. But what I heard you saying was something which I hear a lot, it's quite common, that Jesus, in fact, just felt like he was forsaken by God. But that can't be.
That's what you're saying if you think that what he experienced was disillusionment, because disillusionment is just a privatized psychological state of one's perceived experience of reality.
Okay.
So you're the one making that claim, not me.
All right. Okay. So
unless I'm not
no,
anyway.
I understand. I mean, I think I just want clarity to say that Jesus did not experience disillusionment.
So if good. So you've either got to think that Jesus So this is good. So if we take the humility of Jesus seriously, then I think that we have to come out with the fact that Jesus probably did not hold false beliefs, because he had the epistemic humility to not go beyond his cognitive capacity. So he just didn't make claims about knowing certain things that he didn't know. That's what a principle of parsimony, that's the sort of what a principle of parsimony should do for us. If we look, at Jesus just as an actual person, if he had great epistemic humility, he wouldn't claim to know things that he didn't have an awareness of knowing them. Now, if he was disillusioned, then he had beliefs about the world that ended up being false, not just like trivially false, because remember, disillusionment has to do with the sort of core passions, self-awareness of one's identity and community. And so if Jesus experienced disillusionment, then he was wrong about the fabric of the universe in a real sense. Now, that's a very high epistemic cost, because you might say that what you've done is honored the humanity of Jesus, which I don't think that you have, because to do that would be to have a high view of Jesus's epistemic humility, but then you've also sacrificed the divinity of Christ in any sort of way where Jesus can now be completely wrong about the most important things about reality.
And so thinking
That,
about
that seems to be
thinking
a
about
cost.
the theology
Either
of
way.
the synoptic gospels, particularly Mark, Mark avoids that problem by having Jesus predicting very clearly his death and resurrection, so nothing could come as a surprise. Then
I don't-
from that
yeah.
sense of disillusionment.
Well, I'm not saying that either. So we got to be very, very clear. A surprise is when something that you didn't expect happens. That's different than saying a surprise is the opposite of what you expect to happen. So Jesus could be surprised in terms of him not really anticipating the way that the dereliction cry would actually be experienced. I'm not saying that that can't be the case. I'm saying his epistemic humility would not lead him to make claims to know those things.
Thank you very much.
Those are awesome ideas, though.
Okay, two more.
Fun. Sorry, I got selfish there and just.
All right.
Got one over here.
Okay.
I'm not a philosopher or a theologian. I'm a humble scientist. One of the words that has been put out here over and over is epistemology.
Mhm.
And my experience in teaching students in science is that they have no clue what that word is, how it's defined, and yet how it is so intertwined with what they do. And I wondered if you might give us a nice, solid definition of epistemology. But also then the second part is related to why we're so disillusioned with science or scientists. Because we've had preached to us, and I chose that word intentionally, over and over and over, that we live in a physical environment that must be explained only by physical mechanisms. And that's what we have hammered on for decades now. So it's not only that scientists may come up with the wrong answer, the wrong prediction, but it's also that we start to realize when we reflect that the soul is real. And that realization that there is a physical and a metaphysical. There's a physical and a spiritual. That realization makes this mantra, whatever you want to call it, that's been hammered at us decade after decade, that we're nothing but a bag full of chemical reactions and that there is nothing more, to hit home. And that is great dissonance. So am I onto something there on the science part of this thing and why there's disillusionment with science? I think I am. But I'll let you handle that epistemology if you would be so kind. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, those are wonderful. I want to say something about both of those because I think that you're right. And I might be a philosopher, but I'm not tenured, so you still have the advantage over me. That was a stupid academic joke. Most academic jokes are stupid. So epistemology, how I like to explain it to people that have not studied philosophy, is it's the sort of thing that you do when you get in fights with your parents or your friends or your significant others. That is, you're going to make claims about whether or not the other person knows what they're talking about. Epistemology just is the study of what it means or what it is to know something, what it is to believe something, what it is to be certain of something, what it is to doubt something. So the epistemologist wants to study, well, oh, look, you say that you know what it's, you have an understanding, or you're claiming to know that murdering is wrong. What does that mean? I take it to mean that you mean something more than you just believe it. Or it's just something that you like, that you're just saying, I'm not saying the world is really this way where things are actually right or wrong. It's just, I'm just sort of emoting that I just don't like a world with murder in it. Now, it seems like you're saying something deeper than that. You're saying something like, look, this idea that murder is wrong is a fact about the world that I have discovered. That is, or another way to think about it is, the knowledge relation is supposed to be one where your mind changes based on how the world is, versus thinking that the world changes based on how your mind is. Another, like, just to put it in theological terms, one is humility and the other one is radical arrogance. Humility meaning I ought to form my beliefs and ideas to how the world actually is, versus the world, I expect the world to be the way it is because I've thought about it this particular kind of way. So epistemology, I think, is actually a subset of ethics. It's about how it is that you rightfully or wrongfully form your beliefs and make claims about what's real. And so you've got this ethical demand to make those claims based on the right kinds of, reasons, evidence, experiences to that domain, right? The chemist can use their tools to discover items of chemistry, but if you can't use a telescope to study molecular organisms, right? You have to take it as it is. So knowledge, epistemology studies knowledge. Knowledge is this enterprise of trying to figure out how it is that I can come to know the world as it is. How can I form my mind in response to how it actually is? So it's a deeply community-based and driven enterprise. At least it ought to be. And so now, if I could say, another thing or two about what you said about the sciences, I think that that's so correct. The science, and I would start too with just, it's a misnomer to talk about science as a thing. There are sciences. And it is very difficult to figure out what counts and doesn't count as a science. This is called the demarcation problem in the philosophy of science. If it's got to be something that's repeatable, well, now you're going to lose the sorts of physics that deals with the origin of the universe, because that's not repeatable. If it's going to have to be something that's empirically verifiable, well, now you've just gotten rid of lots of physics. And you go on through the list. So one is, we're just confused about what science is, that it's a domain that does really, really well over here, but has no business working over here, right? So when we have expectations about what the scientists can deliver to us and they're not met, part of that is our own fault for thinking that they should have been held responsible for making good on those claims in the first place. But then you've also got the hubris of the scientists to think that, like I said with the physicalist, that the physicist is going to at the end of the day, come up with the grand unified theory that explains what love is, what consciousness is, these sorts of things. Absolutely right.
All right, I'm going to issue a retraction, and that will have been the last question. So first of all, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.
And if you have more questions, good news, he'll be around, and we have the reception with wine and cheese. And by the way, before we go, I should also thank the sponsor of the series, so the Hilda E. Bretzloff Foundation. So many thanks to them. So that will be it. We will have another one of these in the spring. So thank you all for coming. Have a great night and see you in the spring.